Right. Great. So, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming and for joining this special event. I am, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sara Riccardi and I am an art historian and I work freelance. So I connect with different institutions and places and deliver events that are meant to be educational but also as engaging and lively as possible. My strongest passion is to make the history of art and the heritage and our cultural heritage accessible and enjoyable for the widest public possible. I have been establishing a long collaboration with Saul Hay Gallery, and in fact our collaboration started 2 years ago because we met during the previous edition of Manifest Arts Festival, which this event is a part of. So it's a special pleasure for me to be hosting this event here tonight because 2 years ago I was new to the city of Manchester. I had just started, I had this idea of trying to be a freelance art historian and bringing the art history in places that were not the academia. But I didn't know, I literally had no connections in the city. And then I realized that there was this thing called Manifest Arts Festival that was happening, and I thought that an arts festival was the best way for me to possibly get started. And so 2 years ago, I was going around, I did as many open studios as I could, and I attended as many events as possible, and started creating some connections. Saul Hay Gallery was one of the places that I visited as part of Manifest 2 years ago, and I am here tonight contributing to the new edition of the festival. So I am extremely grateful to the festival for having me. We have two out of three co-directors of the festival, Elisa Artesero and Roger Bigert, and John Lynch is the third one, which is here in spirit. And I am incredibly thankful to Manifest for existing, for existing and for having done what they have done 2 years ago, which has allowed me to meet Catherine and Ian of Saul Hay Gallery, and I'm thankful to them as well for having been collaborating with me so much throughout these 2 years. So this is a little bit of a background, and I thought I wanted to take this opportunity to thank the people who have been allowing me to develop this thing that has gone way beyond what I was envisioning 2 years ago when I started, and not just Catherine and Ian, but also all the rest of the artists and places in Greater Manchester that have been so friendly and welcoming to me. So I really feel part of the art scene in Manchester today, and it's something that I would have not imagined 2 years ago. So this is why it's also a personal pleasure to be here, but the art historian inside of me has really appreciated the opportunity of researching this subject of the artist studio. This has developed because Manifest Arts Festival has a whole program of different events, but the backbone of it is the trail of open studios. So studios around Greater Manchester, in the city centre and other borough, have been opening their doors to visitors for people to experience what artists do in their spaces, in the behind the scenes of the creation of art. So this gave me and Roger, we had a conversation a few months ago, and from that conversation we realized that looking at the context, the historical context of the space of the studio could have been a good way of responding to this festival for me to do what I do, which is putting things into context historically. And it has been great because actually the space is not something that as art historians we tend to focus on that much. We focus on the biographies of artists, we focus on the masterpieces they have created, but the space doesn't get as much attention. But through the research that I have undertaken for this, I have realized that actually the studio is way more than just a space where an artist works. So I would like to share with you some, as always, it's so frustrating when I go through the research and then I go to the actual preparation. I realize that I have to cut out so much. But I will be sharing with you some of the stimuli and ideas that I've been able to explore. As often in my events, I try to find ways of connecting what I say about the past to the present. In this case, the connection was there because I was responding to the Open Studio, but also I wanted to have the voices of Greater Manchester artists as part of this. So I put I put a survey online which artists could respond to. It was anonymous, so I have the answers, but I honestly don't know who participated in it and who wrote what. And I have been connecting some of the themes that I've explored to the answers that people have given to the survey. So there will be references to that. And I thought that this was a good idea of looking at what we know about how artists felt about the studio in the past through indirect sources and documents, and also having the direct voices of those who live the studio today. As this was one of the questions, what type of studio do you have? And this is how the answers were split. So the majority, half of the respondents had my own space in a studio group, the middle green. So, and also the bottom one says studio in mixed use Victorian cotton mill, that's how it goes on, which is also a group, a space with various studios. And the 20% had a shared space in a studio group. So the vast majority of the respondents actually work in spaces that are community-based. Half of them have their own space, but with the possibility of engaging with other artists. And this is one first element that was interesting for me, that the actual practice of art is conducted in a way that's both isolated but also social. And when it came to some of the answers, these are some quotes that highlight that aspect of having a group around you. So one person said, "It's where I can discuss my ideas with other studio artists, work collaboratively, if I choose, find support, or the studio connects me to an organization and group." And one person said, "I'd love to have my studio in a community of artists." So this is clearly someone who doesn't, but wishes to. And this was interesting for me to realize, because you might not agree. I haven't mentioned the fact that there will be time for questions at the end, but I'm always happy. Not only it doesn't bother me, but I'm actually happy if at any point you want to ask a question why I am speaking. I'm happy about that. So one of this sense of community was interesting for me to observe in the answers coming from contemporary artists, because in my mind, being classically trained, having specialized in 15th century Italian painting, so the most classical that you can think of, the artist in the studio looks a bit more like this. Is it too bright? Or can you see the image well? Okay, good. So this is a painting by, that's better. This is a painting by the French master of Romanticism, Eugène de la Foix. So it is painted centuries after Michelangelo, which is the subject of the painting. So it is painted in 1850. And this is a master of Romanticism imagining how, according to his own sensibility, one of the greatest or the old masters of Renaissance would have looked like in his studio. So the idea, the vision of the artist in the studio that some of us still might have or still exists in society comes a lot from this romantic imagery of the solitary genius engaged in a tormented battle with the creative act. In fact, what is interesting is the fact that the artist is not represented in the act of making art. He has thrown the tools of his work on the floor, and what we see here is actually the mind of the artist at work. And this, to a romantic artist, looked like the epitome, the peak of creative experience. I would argue that this is a rather limited view. There are bits, as I'm going to explore with you, that do exist in the artistic experience, but I think this is partial. It's not the totality of what the experience of the artist in the studio can be, which is way more exciting. And also, I think it's important to recognize the fact that this sort of idea somehow is still with us, but I think not the majority of the artists feel comfortable with this, or possibly they don't see themselves represented so much in something like this. So it's great to be able to create possibly new mythologies and new ideas around what the artist and the studio are and do. So here we have what was interesting for me was to realize how solitary this is, and how much instead in the real experience of people the studio had a lot of social to it. This is another example which might make us argue something different, because this is a painting that I've used for the promotion of the event, in fact. And unlike the previous one, this is not something realized later during the Romantic era, when the idea of the creative genius had already been nourished by centuries of artistic narrative. This is a painting by Rembrandt, directly by himself, representing what he feels as his condition. So it's not filtered through the centuries, as the previous example was, but it's actually an artist in the 1600s representing the artist studio. We don't know exactly whether this is a self-portrait or not. Possibly it's not necessarily a self-portrait, but it's just a symbolic representation of the experience of the artist in the studio. And again, we see that solitary experience. And once more, we don't see the act of painting in this case, but we see the figure of the artist being rather dwarfed by the artwork, which we don't see. So we see the back of the painting, and we don't even know whether it is finished, and the artist is contemplating it, wondering whether to add another mark, or if he is just about to start and is looking at the blank canvas, which is a feeling many painters talk about. So we have him with his tools in his hands, not working, but again, contemplating, looking, using his mind. I will come back to this idea of the mind. Make us say, well, if an artist did it himself, then perhaps this is not a myth or a mythology that has been developed later. It is actually how artists feel, which might be the case. One thing that I've realized is that the studio is a place that escapes complete definition, because art escapes it, and the experience of an artist is something that can't be put into exact categories. But still, I thought it was interesting to see how that solitary artistic creative was expressed through the lens of a romantic artist, but also by an artist himself. Now, I would like to go through the centuries, or at least pinpoint some moments in which the studio changed its physiognomy. So, about the Middle Ages, we have very little visual documents about the studio of the artist. The majority of what we know comes from stories or writings about artists, and we have the literature that we can use to know how workshops used to work during the Middle Ages. The artist in the Middle Ages was basically an artisan. What they were recognized for was their manual ability, and their role in society was that of someone who made objects. In the case of artists in the Middle Ages throughout Europe, the majority of the objects they created were religious objects, because they were working widely for the commissions that came from the religious institutions. So they were providing society with objects that were needed for devotion. There was way less the idea of the creative act and of the creative inspiration, and it was much more a concept of creating those objects that were needed for religious purposes. And the way in which the space of the artist worked reflected this social condition and vision of art and the artist. So from the 12th century, different trades and professions organized themselves into guilds, professional guilds, which were groups of professionals of a same field, which were meant to exist in order to regulate the trade and have guarantees for those who worked in that specific trade. It applied to all the professions, and artists had their own guilds as well. And they regulated how the workshop worked. So the medieval workshop structure had the masters at the top of the studio, so those who had completed their training, and they were the only ones who were given by the guild the professional rights. So they were the only ones allowed to buy raw materials, they were the only ones allowed to sell in the market, which existed in a different way. It was not the open market that we have today. It was way more through commissions, but they were the only one allowed to directly sell, and they were the only ones allowed to train young apprentices. Then in the workshops worked as group spaces. So the work was as any artisan workshop, artistic workshops as well. The work was undertaken by all different people at different levels. So the masters were mainly overseeing the structure and guaranteeing the quality of the products that came out of the workshop. Then there were the journeymen, who were at the second level, and they were paid craftsmen. They were skilled, able to do the trade, and were paid by a day wage, usually by the master. Some of them sometimes lived with the masters, so some of them became associated strongly with a specific workshop, but they could also work with different workshops. So it's a completely different idea even of the concept of copyright and the authority of one artist being the complete author of a work. This was a much more grouped sort of way of making art. And then there were the apprentices, those who wanted to learn, and the way for them to learn was simply, as for any artisan trade, the way for them was to shadow the master, to be alongside them, and to see how the work was undertaken. And they were given board and lodging while learning, and they were allowed to help with basic tasks, like grinding pigments, famously in painters' workshops, or cleaning up tools. And while they were learning those basic skills, they were observing around them in order to gradually improve their skills. So there was no theoretical training at all, which again reflected how art was seen and perceived in medieval society. And this is the bell tower of the Cathedral of Florence, and it is decorated by some tiles, and well, they are here, but the original ones are now in a museum for preservation purposes. And of all the various tiles, they represent all the art of man. And there are these three: painting, sculpture, and architecture. And these three tiles are very precious when one looks at the studio, because they are considered to be among the very early visual representations of the artist at work. So you can see that both the painter and the sculptor really look like artisans. This is in the mid-14th century, so it's in the late Middle Ages, and there was already a certain interest in the classical world. That's why the artists look a bit like Greek philosophers with those long beards and the clothes that they are wearing. But both the painter and the sculptor, they are in a rather simple space. They simply have the tools that they need to work, and they are producing the objects they are meant to be producing. In the case of the architect, there is a very interesting difference in the space that he inhabits, because if you look at him, he is sat in a rounded chair and has a slightly tilted desk in front of him, and looking closely, he is working with probably a compass. So in the case of the architect, it seems like the focus is starting to shift from the manual production to an activity that has got an intellectual element in it. And the space says this, as well as the fact that he's working with a compass, because this painting, which is one of the masterpieces of Antonello da Messina, and if we zoom in, you can see that this figure, who is Saint Jerome, and Saint Jerome is one of the greatest scholars. So representing Saint Jerome in the study was a way of representing one of the epitome of the idea of the scholar, and he is there studying the Bible, and he is sat in a similarly rounded chair. He also has got a tilted reading desk with a book on it, so the activity they are undertaking is different, but the space they are in has got similarities. And these similarities are incredibly important to show us, as I say, a slightly gradual change and shift in what was perceived to be the work of artists. Of course, the case of the architect is slightly different because the intellectual work is more clear. But at the time, architecture, painting and sculpture were grouped together as the three arts based on drawing. So this shift happening for the architect meant that gradually that would apply to the painter and the sculptor as well. And this would happen during the Renaissance. So the medieval workshop was a group space, very much a space where people worked together, all together on the same objects. Around 150 years after those tiles were produced, Leonardo da Vinci wrote, "If you must have companionship, find it in your studio." And this was an advice, a piece of advice he was giving directly to artists. In his writings, there are chapters in which he speaks directly to the prospective artists. And we see that sentence in which he, in the context of it, he is talking about the fact that social activities and being around many people and having many people coming and going from your studio might distract you from the work that you have to do. So the fact that Leonardo in the 1500s was saying this shows a transition and a change in the way in which artists themselves were starting to think about what they were doing and what making art could entail. The reason for this advice to make sense by this time is that the idea of making art having to involve an aspect of intellectual activity which requires concentration and solitude had been accepted, accepted by this point. And how art was perceived and the elements that were perceived to be involved in the action of making art influenced also how art was taught. So in the space of the workshop, the young apprentice was simply learning the practical skills. In the 30s of the 1500s, we find images of this kind. So this is an engraving of what is called here Academy of Baccio Bandinelli, who was this Florentine artist. He had groups in his studio who were learning, so young people learning to make art. So far, it might look very similar to what the medieval workshop was. They were still young people learning, but what they are learning and how they are learning is changing from the medieval young apprentice simply being behind the shoulder of the master making the work. They are being taught directly, and they are being taught by observing small models of classical sculpture. So they are learning by looking at previous examples and copying them and making drawings from them. And in this way, they are given the theoretical as well as practical structure for them to become fully trained artists. So it's a gradual and slight shift from the structure of the medieval workshop to the structure of the private academy where artists were trained, but it's a central one because, as I say, the space of the studio became, from a space of production, it became a space of study, and study involves the mind. Then, of course, they went on producing the artworks, and the aspect of the practical production was pretty much the same, and they still started off by grinding pigments and then gradually learned more complex skills. But by this time, the theory of art was going alongside the practical aspect, and that changed the physiognomy of the studio. Then private academies became then full public institutions. The British Academy, the Royal Academy of Art here, was founded on the model of the French and Italian academies, which were the spaces where the training was given, and it was a fully structured training which involved both elements of theory of art and practical elements. So the medieval guilds had developed as ways for artists to be controlled in their trade, for them to have guarantees and to protect the practical art, the quality of the pigments and all the rest. Academies developed for the theory to be included in the training that artists received. So this does not mean that apprentices stopped being trained within masters' workshops, but there was the institution of the academy as the chief training place. So the studio changed its physiognomy a little bit. Going back to this image then, the idea of Michelangelo, so deep in thought, somehow is better contextualized now, having realized the fact that the activity of the mind was an important achievement for artists to be recognized. Artists throughout the Renaissance really wanted to see the fact that their activity involved thoughts and creative processes that went on in their mind to be recognized, and the existence of the academy was a huge achievement for artists to see their social status recognized and changing. Still, this shows some elements of what the activity was, not all of them. Also, in the specific case of Michelangelo, we do know that he didn't like to have pupils, he didn't like to have people around him, and to him, that idea of the tormented, solitary, creative genius kind of applies, but the fact that it applies to him doesn't mean that it has to apply to the category, to the wider category of the artist in general. So, going back to the surveys, some of the answers from the surveys, I found that there were these elements of having a space in which one can think. So the studio gives me physical and contemplative space in which to work through ideas. So this element of the idea obviously does exist strongly for contemporary artists today. I've been able to make more work since having a studio. Having a studio space that is removed and isolated from the everyday existence and perceived normality of life gives my work a room to dream, a separation and ability to focus fully. So, okay, I will finish and then. Having a studio helps you to switch off from the outside world and focus all your attention to your art. This is where I think and talk. Having a studio has enabled me to have a more professional approach to my work, to develop my skills and discuss ideas with other studio members. So there's the element of developing the skills and feeling more professional about your work, which connects to the learning aspect of the studio. But also there's a lot of reflection on the possibility of being on your own in a solitary experience. So because the activity of the mind sometimes requires that, So even from the answers to the survey, there's this dynamic between isolation and social activity that is characteristic of the studio. Moving forward, so as I say, academies started off by being private and then developed as proper institutions that were structured. There was a transformation in the actual architecture of studios that reflected the fact that the medieval workshop was changing its structure. So previously, as I say, the whole work was carried out by the masters and the journeyman and the apprentice in the same space, and they were all collaborating. From the 1500s, we see in some paintings, and there are some written documents, sometimes they are a little bit ambiguous, so it's subject to interpretation, but it's a very likely hypothesis, the fact that artists started to have separated areas in which the workshop was the wider space where the work was carried out by the master with the help of the apprentice and the students. But then there was a more separate space, a space that usually was smaller and more isolated, where the master could be on their own and work through their ideas and create the projects and create the designs, and mainly drawing, which was considered the process of working through ideas visually. So the separation between these two areas, the space of the communal work and the space of the master going through ideas, reflects the change in the attitude towards the act of making art. The physical space reflects the double nature of making art through the Renaissance. This is one example. It is very dark and the actual painting is very dark. But Lavinia Fontana, who is a Renaissance painter, is here represented in a space that looks very tight. It's a self-portrait, first of all, so it's an important way in which she wanted to be perceived as an artist. She is in this small, dark space, and she is about to set pen on paper. Usually it is said that she is going to be drawing, so going through the process of drawing, which is the basis of making art, possibly copying from these sculptures, small copies of sculptures that she has in front of her. But she could also be just about to start writing, for as much as we know. So the fact that an artist can represent herself in a position and in a space that could be at the same time for drawing or for writing, and it's a separate space of isolation and study, shows us again that shift in the perception of the artist and in the way in which the artist feels they are inhabiting the space of the studio. And another example of a similar thing is this, completely different in tone and color and grandeur, by Giorgio Vasari, who is mainly famous for having written the lives of the artists, but he was also a painter. And in this fresco, he represents himself as Saint Luke, painting the figure of the Virgin, which, according to the legend, had appeared to Saint Luke, and he had created the very first painting. That's why Saint Luke is the patron of artists. So he is in a space painting directly from the inspiration that comes to him. So he is receiving the creative inspiration and creating a new design. And in a separate room in the back, there is an assistant grinding the pigments. So again, it looks like there are two separate spaces for the two different activities. The fact that he is surrounded by a number of figures doesn't mean that he is in company. He is actually meant to be considered isolated in solitude. These are all symbolic figures, religious figures, representing, well, the Virgin appearing and representing the inspiration that he is getting. So again, we see him in the act of conceiving a new painting, separated from where the group activity and the more manual aspect of the work happens. academies became the center of the art world in countries like Italy, France, and Spain. They developed way less and had way less importance in the Northern Europe, and then Britain as well had the academy. In the Northern European area of Germany, the Flanders, and the Netherlands, academies never really developed, and the structure of the studio remained pretty much more similar to what a medieval workshop would have looked like. And the guilds still retained importance in the northern area. So in this example, we see a very busy workshop with the master in the center working on a religious painting, and then young apprentice studying, copying, working on with colors, some of them in the back grinding the pigments. And there's another artist here working on a portrait, which is probably of a lesser level than the master, who is working on a bigger and higher level subject. And there's the model there, so he's painting from life, and the model is probably a noble woman who is accompanied by her maiden. So it's a very nice representation of all the activities that happen in the studio and how lively and diverse the atmosphere is. So it's a different sort of environment from what the Italian Renaissance studio was developing. But this is the context in which Rembrandt was also working. And if we go back to this image, Rembrandt, we know from documents that Rembrandt, at the peak of his career, had around 50 assistants and students in his studio. So certainly his studio didn't really look like this. This is not meant then to be a representation of his real experience during the day. His studio would have looked way more like this. So it is even more meaningful knowing that he decides to create a representation of this kind to show the artist in the studio. So that idea of the artistic endeavor involving an element of moments of this type is actually not completely a mythology, not completely something that has developed during the Romantic time, but it's something that is part of the experience of artists. But again, just as for Michelangelo's painting, this is not the only thing that is required to make art. In this period, because in the north of Europe academies had less importance and the studio continued to be pretty much a social experience, the whole art world was structured in a different way. So the open market was way more important to the development of art than direct commissions. Increasingly so, in the northern area of Europe, artists started to work not by direct commissions, but simply producing art that was then put on the art market. This meant that artists had to improve their networking skills, and the studio changed yet again, and from the place of production and the place of study and the place of training and of creative inspiration, it also became a place of networking and connecting with people and talking to people who were somehow connected to the art world but not necessarily artists. So this is an example of a painting from the 1700s that shows us how the studio has really opened to the public. And this is something that happened a lot in the north of Europe and then also in the south of Europe, where it was still more of an elitist place, so less people were allowed in artist studios in that countries where the academy had created a certain artistic world. In the north of Europe, it really became a commercial hub, where all the work of providing new patrons and potential collectors and showing work to critics, all of that happened in the studio. as it still does today. I would say that the idea of the studio visit developed in this period, in this context. So here we see the artist dressed as a nobleman. He is far from being the medieval artisan, but he is a man that is connected to all the highest strata of society. And there's this man here that is both interpreted as the art critic, making his remarks on the piece still in the process of being produced, or a scholar that is giving advice on the iconography by using the book that he has. And then there are the two rich people that are potential buyers, potential customers, well, potential patrons. And so that, and you still see the always present assistant grinding the pigments there, and in the back room, two young artists making copies from paintings that are in that room. So the studio is getting more layers to it. Nothing is disappearing. There is still the element of teaching and training people who start from the basic skills. There is still the element of young artists with more skills studying from the work of the master, but then there is also this additional layer. So the studio is widening up and more activities are being undertaken in it. And I thought it was incredibly interesting because one of the answers in the survey about studio visits, I don't even remember what the question was, but there was one answer that stated studio politics can affect artistic concerns. And this I thought was very interesting because it really reflects how an artist who might want to be more focused on the artistic side, once the studio becomes a space in which politics happens and goes on, they can realize that sometimes this can distract from. I am sorry, I will stop dropping stuff now. So this element of the the studio politics being distracting, I thought was incredibly insightful. Of the studio is not only a wonderful place, and not everything that happens in it is perfect, and it's just the majority of the answers stated how good having a studio is, but also there are complexities about it and things that might take away from the actual creative endeavor. One chief example of having a studio as something more than even these things that we have said so far is Rubens. Rubens, not only did he had a huge workshop that at the peak of his career, Rubens' workshop was the biggest in the whole of Europe. He really ran his studio with an entrepreneurial spirit, and he had an army of assistants who were working in his styles in order to provide all the collectors who wanted a Rubens with the paintings that they wanted. So the group model was still existing, but applied in a completely different way. He was also an art collector, and this is yet another level. So the space of the artist become a space where artists can display their art collection. And for an artist to collect work by other artists is a way to show their artistic taste and the fact that they are fully rounded professionals of the art world. So as we see the space of the studio becoming a space where more things happen, it actually reflects how the figure of the artist becomes a figure that is more rounded, and the layers of what being an artist is increase. So Rubens had in his palazzo that he had bought in Antwerp, in the city of Antwerp, he made some renovations to it in order to have a huge studio, and this is the view of the extension to his studio. And we can still visit Rubens' house in Antwerp, and although it has been completely renovated, part of his collection is still hosted there. So the space of the artist is showing him also as a collector is yet another aspect that widens up the figure of the artist and his position in the art world. We have a fascination still today with the idea of visiting the studio of an artist. The reason Rubens' house is one example, but there are plenty of artist studios that have been preserved and are used as museums to display the work of the artists. And I think part of the fascination that we have with being able to enter the space of creativity of an artist who is dead, perhaps, part of that fascination is connected to that myth of the solitary genius and the idea of that space as being a sacred space where a almost magical activity happens. And that is something that is portrayed in paintings like that of Michelangelo. But even if we take a distance from that sort of mythology and idea, I think that being able to see the environment where an artist was working can really add to our experience of that art, just like seeing a painting or a sculpture or a piece of art in the flesh is different from seeing reproductions of it. About studio visits, this is what people feel today about this practice of having people in your space, which started off when the art world opened up to the art market, but it's still very much ongoing today. So they are a work of art in themselves. I thought that was beautifully said. These are integral to the working process. And this is interesting about the idea of the studio being the place where the work is undertaken in all its different possible expressions, which is not just making art. It's good to show people around, especially those who are interested and with whom you can have an intelligent discussion. So the element of the exchange with the exterior world is still important. Having a studio open there is a great way to interact with potential customers and show them your creative process. And this is exactly what was going on in the previous painting. The painter was showing his creative process as the painting on his or was work in progress and hoping to attract potential customers. But also, I'm not keen having people in my space. That can also be the case, depends on the visitor, fair enough. I like talking to people who are interested enough to visit me, and then it said I've had a couple having a domestic argument in my studio, which I thought was a wonderful example of this studio, this idea of the studio really opening up to the world and even housing domestic arguments by people who don't belong there, but that aura of the sacred, secluded, isolated space is completely defeated by an episode like this. So we have studio museums, and as I say, there are plenty. Some of them are still in the building where the artist used to live and work. Some of them have been reconstructed, and they become sort of huge artworks, installation artworks in themselves. This is the case with the Atelier Brancusi. So this is the studio of sculptor Brancusi, who was a Romanian sculptor who lived in Paris in the first half of the 20th century. And when he died, he left his own studio to the French state, but then the building was actually knocked down, and all the pieces in the studio have been variedly rearranged and reconstructed. And currently, this is the reconstruction in the Centre Pompidou, opposite the Centre Pompidou in Paris. Brancusi developed a type of research in his sculpture that involved a great deal of analysis and research on how the pieces actually interacted with the space around them. So for him, the space of the studio was not simply a needed environment in which to make art, but it became completely connected to the actual art. So much so that towards the end of his life, if he would sell a piece, he made a plaster replica of it in order not to change the balance of the whole studio. So he developed a relationship with the space of the studio, which was pretty much the relationship that he had with his actual, as if the studio was the whole artwork that he had been producing, because of this strong connection between the single objects and the space they inhabited. So even more so, as the 20th century happened, the possibilities of what the studio could mean to an artist have been expanding widely. Yes, so I'm just... Okay, let's quickly run through the main points that we have been looking at so far, going towards the conclusion. So in the Renaissance, the studio of the artist really transformed from the medieval artisan workshop. The intellectual aspect of the work got recognized, so the workshop and the studio where the creation is undertaken are separate spaces, and this architectural separation reflects the recognition of both aspects. And then in the era of the academies in the south of Europe and the open art market in the north of Europe, there is a diversification of studios, many layers, all the different aspects involved can be experienced in the studio according to the new elements of artist identity. Those who had art collections, that was an element that was involved in the space, and the opening of the studio to the world. Then the 20th century, what is interesting is that this change, this transformation, as I said, had been really wished for by artists. Artists in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance really wanted to see the art world being shaped in a way that reflected what they felt about what they were doing, which recognized their intellectual status. But then that structure developed into the whole academy system, and in 2 or 3 centuries, that system was not reflecting how artists felt anymore. Again, there was a new change, and people like the Impressionists were among the first to try and radically challenge that whole system. They did it in many different ways. One of the ways they did it was in using the space of the studio differently from what it had been done. So, for instance, having studio boats, which was completely unheard of, but Monet painted by Manet. I love the fact that Impressionists do this. They were painting each other, having this strong sense of community. So this shows us Monet painting in his self-built and self-arranged studio boat, because the type of art that he was doing, the type of connection with the landscape that he was developing, required him a space that was a different one, that was not separated from the outside landscape. So he developed this. Also, Impressionists started to use the actual space in different ways, focusing way more on, as I say, the community aspect. So having those spaces as spaces of connection and conversation and reflection on what they were doing. And then from this complete break through the whole structure in which art had been one thing and therefore the studio had been something, the 20th century happened, and in the 20th century art could be way more than what it had been in the previous centuries, so the studio could be more as well. And today critics and historians talk about a post-studio generation. There are artists who don't feel the need of a studio anymore, or there are artists who still have a space they work into, but they don't live it with any of the characteristics of the historical studio. I have mentioned Brancusi and his relation to the space, but the research that was so strongly connected to looking at the artwork in the context of the space it inhabits is typical of 20th century avant-garde. Brancusi was not the only one. Louise Bourgeois looked at it intensively, and Calder as well, just to mention two examples. So the fact that artworks can become objects that have a specific connection to a specific space means that sometimes artists have to create the work directly on site if they are site respondent, for instance. And in this case, the space of the studio can be the space where the thoughts are worked through, but it's not anymore the space of the creation of the work. Or the most radical example that I could think of is land art, that completely breaks free from all the boundaries, physical, architectural boundaries of the studio, but also of the museum and the gallery, which were meant to be the places where the work was going next. And it was always meant to leave the studio to go into either a museum or a private collection. With land art, none of this apply, and it's really the opposite of that, again, secluded and separated from the rest of the world space that we have looked. It's the outside world that contains the art. So the 20th century really challenges all the ideas about the studio, but even more considering how the studio was already a rather complex idea in the previous centuries. This is an example of someone who lived the studio and his real life, daily life, as completely integrated. Klimt had a number of studios. This specific one was on the ground floor of a big house in Vienna, and he had around 15 or 20 cuts. These cuts were allowed in the studio all the time. He never tried to keep them out of the studio, and there were friends being a bit concerned about these cuts stepping on the canvases and peeing everywhere, but he would say that that was actually the best natural fixative that he could find, so he never wanted to ban the cuts from the studio. So this is an example of an experience of the studio completely embedded into the daily life of the artist. And we could go on and have infinite examples, but going back to this, is this way of thinking about the artist in the studio really a way that is faithful to the idea of the artist in the studio? I am a huge, Michelangelo is my own personal favorite artist ever. So I personally do love that mythology of the creative, tormented genius lost in thoughts. But on a professional level, I have to recognize the fact that this is a little part of what being an artist can be, and how an artist can live in his studio. This is far from being the only way or the best way. Also, that mythology of the creative genius had some real issues, one of them being that it applies only to male artists. The whole idea of the genius has been always presented through the idea of the male. Women were said to be unable to be geniuses, so it doesn't really apply. So the fact that this now has been challenged over and over again, I think it's very positive, in fact. And I'm hoping for the development of new mythologies. There's nothing wrong with having a fictionalized idea, but it's good to have ideas that can apply to a wider, to more artists, that more artists can recognize into. So, to finish off, I feel like it has been impossible for me to define the studio, to find a definition of it. I feel like it is a place of contradictions. It is at the same time a space where people can be isolated and social. It is a space where one can learn or simply manually do things or go through ideas. It is a place for the hand and for the mind. It is a place that helps but sometimes might distract from the creative activity. So I could only find those contradictions, but I think they all make what the creative experience is. And the fact that so many different artists live the space today, after all those centuries in which the space has been gradually gaining a wider sense and a wider possibilities, today artists have all those possibilities to choose from. So I would encourage you to go pick a Manifest Arts Festival program, go and see some of the studios. There are more open studios this coming weekend, and you will be able to actually enter that space that is not only the space of sacred creative production, but it's also a space where domestic arguments happen and many things can happen, and it's wonderful to see them reflecting the variety of what the artistic expression can be. So on this note, I will thank you very much indeed for listening, and if there are any questions, I'm very happy. Questions or thoughts or ideas or comments or whatever, we can open up to these.